Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? There is a button to reactions. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? All right, perfect. All right. So, welcome to this 56-bit webinar, Migrate and Modernize with AWS. If at any point you cannot hear me or you cannot see the presentation, please do let me know. There is a Q&A section where you can ask questions. You can ask questions at any time, or you can ultimately tell me if there are any issues. Atiri is our co-organizer, and she will handle any issues that may crop up. So thank you for joining. My name is Patrick Camilleri. I'm going to be presenting this webinar today. Just a little bit about me before we start, talking about migration on AWS. So I'm the senior technical consultant of 56-bit. I've been in the industry for 18 plus years now, have worked with a number of large companies and medium-sized companies, have worked on AWS for the last 5 years, and have a number of certifications, and I'm also an educator, basically, on AWS. I've done teaching engagements with a number of large companies like BMW, Audi, IBM, Accenture, and a number of others. And hopefully today I can impart some information, some knowledge on how to use best practices to migrate to AWS. So let's start off by stating something which may not be obvious, which is, why should I migrate to AWS? So there are a number of business drivers, right? Everything ultimately is done from a business perspective. There are business reasons why you would do this. You may want to digitally transform your infrastructure. You might want to make use of new technologies like IoT, AI, and machine learning. You might have multiple data centers and you want to consolidate them into a single data center, into a single vendor. This reduces complexity, it reduces the need for multiple technologies that you have to learn, and also might reduce costs as well. You might want to outsource changes to the hardware, or improve resilience, improve agility, speed up the ability to do changes quickly. You might also want to reduce costs. So these are all things which doesn't have to be a single one. Obviously, it can be multiples of these that are triggers into moving to AWS. These are all things that can be a driver towards AWS technologies. AWS has seen a lot of migrations over the years, thousands of migrations, and on average, they see infrastructure cost savings of around 31%. Now, these numbers are there because they are true, but ultimately, the migrations themselves have to be done in a specific way, in a way which is best practice. So ultimately, there is a good and there is a bad way of doing migrations. And it is important to take note of the best practices that we're going to show in this webinar. 43% fewer security incidents, making use of technologies to ensure that your security is increased exponentially when migrating to AWS. Not just keep it secure, but increase the level of security. 62% staff productivity boost, and a lot of features that AWS delivers every year. Thousands and thousands of features that it delivers every single year to its platform. Today, AWS is a huge system with over 200 services. You will use some of those. You will not use most of them, because ultimately they handle different industries and different things. But you know that you are in the hands of a company that can deliver quality and ultimately keep on building on what it has. Some tangible business outcomes that AWS has seen from moving to its services include things like enhancing software development by 20%, increasing agility, basically, or cost savings, a 52% reduction in TCO. TCO means total cost of ownership. So considering everything when it comes to costs, considering your time you spend to handle things, considering the actual hosting costs, the software costs, all these things, they add up to a TCO, a total cost of ownership. And AWS has on average seen a significant reduction in that total cost of ownership over the years when migrating to it. Increasing availability from 99.7 to 99.999%, for example, for the specific company. It's very common to have 99.99% on AWS if the solution is built with best practices. And ultimately, increase in speed of deployments. From 3M has seen deployments from 6 weeks to 1 week, right? Projects can take a lot less than before. So these are tangible business outcomes which directly affect the bottom line. Some other examples here. Now, these are obviously larger companies. Smaller companies would also benefit, but if you can do it with thousands of servers, you can do it with 1 or 2, right? So it depends on the situation, but you're looking here at migrations of 90 plus apps with 1,200 instances servers, deploying them slowly over 18 months, right? Re-architecting certain specialized systems like Hadoop clusters, or consolidating data centers to reduce cost. So ultimately, the cost savings are in line with the size of migration, but definitely there is room to improve there. So that is the why, right? There are business drivers that can drive why you would want to migrate. But migrations have their challenges, and enterprise migrations can be quite complex. It is something that we see every single day here, that basically you have a situation where you have to know exactly what there is in the systems to make sure that the migrations go well. One of the biggest risks we see is stalled projects, right? Stalled migrations or false starts that never actually move on, or they move on at a much slower pace than we thought they would. And a lot of this has to do with knowledge, and that's knowledge of AWS, but also knowledge of what there is in the system at the moment. So to deconstruct what there is at the moment, the technical environment, is not an easy task, and this webinar will show you a lot of best practices of how to do that, because ultimately that the relationship between those applications that are on-premise or in another cloud, that ability to know what there is will immediately inform you on how to move and how to move properly. So there is things like regulations, cultural HR issues, security policies. All these things could make the environment, the migration, a lot more complex. Some best practices that we see is the importance of having leadership, of having people who are in a position to make decisions, be at the forefront of the migration, be your champions of the migration, right? That leadership is very, very important. That's why it's at the very top there. Setting clear business goals. So I want to consolidate my data centers. I want to decrease my TCO, my total cost of ownership, by X%. Setting clear business goals of what you want to achieve and by when. And also very important is to adopt the ability, or rather the mindset of constantly learning, of developing those cloud skills that you need to migrate and addressing the gaps for when you are migrated, for that day when ultimately you need to operate on AWS. Something that a lot of people do not realize is that during a migration, there is a cost implication. Now, you can reduce this cost. This is known as the migration cost bubble, where you are running probably 2 parallel systems. If you have an on-premise environment and you're migrating to AWS, for a time there, until you're building and you're optimizing and the migration is finished, you have two systems running. They may not be running at the same size, but you still have extra costs. You might have people who are actively working on that migration. People equals time equals money. So all these things increase cost, which you can reduce by shortening the time period that you use to move, the efficiency that you use to move to AWS. Eventually, though, that migration cost bubble, and there is a lot of help, even financial help from AWS, to help with this cost bubble. Once moving to AWS, then you can start reducing that cost by optimizing and improving on that infrastructure. How does a cloud journey usually look like? So in AWS's point of view, we see something like this. So we have time versus value. Let's imagine we have a single workload. You can have hundreds of workloads, but ultimately, let's grab one. And that workload, usually we start experimenting on AWS of how to move it. That is a foundation, which is usually not best practice. You want to create a best practice foundation, a foundation where the account systems on AWS, where the underlying security, the underlying technologies are there ready for that workload to run. And once you have that foundation, what we call a landing zone, that foundation, then you migrate that workload. Until now, just migrating it as it is does not really do much in terms of value. What really gives you value is when you start modernizing and iterating on AWS. So using things like managed services, which help you move towards a more modern system, retiring that technical debt that ultimately allows you to start increasing value exponentially. And you keep on reinventing and ultimately modernizing that application. Now, that can be true for one application, but it can be true for two or more applications, workloads, right? So moving one workload, again, using the same foundation, migrating, and then modernizing and moving up the value stack. You tell me, why don't we modernize before we go to AWS? That is also an option. In fact, we're going to see it later on as one of the options. But usually AWS does suggest to move to AWS as is and then modernize later. And the reason for that is to get as much movement forward as soon as possible. Please don't forget that if there are any questions, feel free to ask in the Q&A. So AWS has a specific way of doing migrations. This is known as the Migration Acceleration Program, MAP. It is being revamped at the moment. So this year it's going to be revamped, but it's very similar to what you're going to be seeing here. So the Migration Acceleration Program is a lot of things, which we're going to discuss, but ultimately from a benefits perspective, AWS has seen significant improvements in cost savings, productivity, agility, and resilience when using MAP versus when not using MAP. What MAP, this Migration Acceleration Program, allows you to do is to follow certain best practices which have been proven through data, through thousands of migrations, have been proven to really help in optimizing and improving that infrastructure. In terms of costs, in terms of agility, in terms of a lot of things. All those business drivers that we talked about before. So what is MAP exactly? Migration Acceleration Program. So first of all, as you can see on the top left, it is a methodology. It has a structure, a best practice structure that you can follow, and it is probably the most important part of the program. Now, it's not just that, though. There are other enablers like partner tooling or tooling from AWS that allows you to do those best practices. And when I say best practices, I don't mean just moving servers around or moving data around, but it's also about a lot of other things, like creating that landing zone that underlying best practice environment, which will handle all those migrations. There are partners like 56-bit who can help with this. It's also part of the program. There are professional services from AWS. There is training certifications. And there is also financial investments that AWS does to help with these migrations. So it is a totality. It's a program with a lot of things built in to help you migrate with as little hassle as possible, basically. So let's talk about the first part, which is the methodology. The methodology is split in 3 stages. There is the assess phase, mobilize phase, migrate, and modernize phases. So let's talk about them in detail. So this may look like a lot. Forget about what the details here, right, for now. So the assess phase, the mobilize, the migrate, and modernize phases. If I had to look at the assess phase, it's basically answering this question. Is it worth migrating? So this is very important that we don't assume that migrating to AWS is the right fit immediately. It may be, there is a good chance that it is, that those business drivers will be achieved, whether it's resilience, whether it's increased productivity, cost savings, etc. There is a good chance, but is it? We need to ask the question and ultimately get an answer and quantify the amounts, right? So this helps us make a business decision of whether to move to AWS and how to move to get those business outcomes. The mobilize phase is all about once you decide to migrate and there is an idea of how, then it's about going much, much deeper, planning it properly, building that underlying foundation, the landing zone, prototyping, ensuring that you have the first workload moved and learning from that prototyping what happens during that process, learning, and ultimately then we go to last phase, which is the migrate and modernize, which is all about migration, right? So moving now, not just a single prototype or proof of concept, as they like to call it. So not just a single workload, but rather now moving multiple workloads and increasing the speed of that migration going forward. But it doesn't stop there. If you just let me go back a bit to a previous slide, if you can see here, just going on to just staying on the migration part doesn't give you much, right? It's not even worth it because value-wise, you are going to remain the same unless you start modernizing, unless you start going towards containers, unless you start going towards serverless, managed services, using the hundreds and hundreds of services that AWS has. That modernization is what really drives up the value. And this phase, the last one, is the very important part, modernizing for increased value. So assess, mobilize, migrate, and modernize. Each part is dependent on the other. And in total, when we are doing anything on AWS, we always follow, when I say we, that's you guys and ourselves as partners, we'll always follow the 5 pillars the 6 pillars of the AWS well-architected framework. So here it's showing 5, the new version has 6. So operational excellence, security, reliability, performance, and cost optimization, and sustainability, which is the latest one. So these are a list of best practices of how to do something, from the simplest security thing, like making sure our databases are not on a public network. That's the most basic you can get, to a lot more, deeper, interesting stuff that a lot of companies do not do. So doesn't mean you have to follow every single thing. Some things may not be required, but the more you follow this, the more best practice you're going to be, the more value you will get. So there are 3 phases, as we said. The first one is it's the first one you're going to do and one of the most important, because with it, you're going to make the right decision. You go deep, but not too deep, So you want to do this as fast as possible. So let's say in 2 or 3 weeks. In 2 or 3 weeks, you come out with an assessment, okay? And obviously 56-bit can do this for you as well. We come out with this assessment, which is answering a question. Should I go to AWS? Are there business values that will come out from going to AWS? But it goes deeper than that by asking how I would go to AWS. How do I achieve those outcomes? So there is a balance here between speed and detail, and ultimately the aim is to answer that question. How do I get started? How do I create a business case to ask to inform my higher management of whether to move or not? Should I move to the cloud? How should I move to the cloud? What do I have in my current environment to be able to move? Is my organization ready to move? So this is not just technological, but there is also an element of people and organizational structure here. The assess phase is one of those phases where stakeholders need to be involved. Depending on the size of the organization, depending on where the knowledge is, you might want to include leaders. Remember, one of the best practices of migrations is to include leadership. Leaders from every department. So departments which obviously are stakeholders, have a stake in this. So procurement or security, head of development, CTO, CFOs, HR, right? So all these people, head of products, etc., all these people can give their input, which in totality, again, answers these questions. So once you involve these people, there are a number of things you might want to do in the assess phase. The middle one there, the Migration Readiness Assessment, or MRA, basically, it is a list of questions. It's a very interesting, deep analysis. Usually we do it using a one-day workshop or a two half-day workshops, where we ask questions to different people. When it comes to security, we ask the security guys. When it comes to the development, we ask the development guys. So everyone has a stake. Everyone has their own opinion and level of knowledge. But together, the assessment will bring out areas where the organization needs to improve before moving to AWS. It gives you a snapshot into how ready you are to move to AWS. Apart from that organizational part, though, there is also the technical aspect of knowing what you have. So AWS has a number of tools here, one of them being Migration Evaluator, which takes which installs agents, and that automatically gathers an inventory of what there is on-premise or in other clouds that can be moved. It takes into consideration things like performance, the architecture, which applications are talking and which servers are talking to other servers, any service level agreements you might need or have, knowledge which is inbuilt into a specific team. So these things, the Migration Evaluator together with the Migration Readiness Assessment, they really inform us of whether we should and how we could move to AWS. But not in too much detail, in enough detail to build a business case, whether it makes sense or not. The Migration Evaluator looks something like this, right? So if I had to show it here, basically it shows us the number of different servers here on premise that are using this type of SQL or this type, or which ones are Windows, which ones are Linux, right? Which ones are not being used or used very barely, right? The zombies. How much the cost of an on-premise environment would cost, the current cost, taking into consideration not just the hosting, but also the time involved to manage that hosting, the power, the electricity, etc. So Migration Evaluator can do this, and then can also bring out an estimate of how it would look like on AWS. So if you had to do it like with like, but also if you had to add certain best practices, like making sure servers are of the right size, and there are lots of options that you can use to ultimately decide whether it's worth it or not, purely from a monetary perspective. So the assess phase will give you what we call a directional business case, a business case that defines the direction where to go. It's not too deep, but it's good enough and fast enough to give you the direction. So I'm going to go to AWS in this way and in this way. The next phase, if you do decide to go to AWS, the next phase is to go into a lot more detail. In that case, you would create a detailed business case, a plan with more information to inform upper management. The MRA, if I may go back as well again, here we have the MRA and the Migration Evaluator. Migration Evaluator is a tool which automatically gathers information. The MRA is a list of questions that we do during a workshop with multiple people involved. Now, the MRA itself, those list of questions, they fall under different perspectives. So the questions are both business related as well as technical. So when it comes to business, you're talking about business outcomes. What value do I want to get from the migration? The roles and the readiness of the people involved. How knowledgeable are they on AWS? How much do they know of those best practices? What governance controls are there? What service level agreements do we need? What laws are there that we need to follow? Or maybe other certifications and attestations that we need to follow. Then there are the technical elements, technical questions, like platform-related ones, security, operations. So there are different sections with different questions that ultimately give you an idea, an answer of whether you're ready or not to move. So next steps, when it comes to the assess phase, this is just the first phase of the migration. We use discovery tools like the Migration Evaluator to calculate how much the current total cost of ownership is and how much it would cost to move and ultimately how much it would cost to stay on AWS. There isn't just this. There are obviously a lot more tools from AWS, but also third parties. The Migration Evaluator also helps you create that business case. And then the MRA, the Migration Readiness Assessment, there is also a shorter version called the CART. These help you understand whether you are ready or not to move. But together, the output of the assess phase is that directional business case, whether to move and how to move. Whether you're ready for it, maybe even get out a top level, slightly detailed, but not too detailed infrastructure diagram, design, a migration plan of what to move, how to move it, timelines. So you start forming an idea. And obviously, if you're doing it with us, you would get also a proposal to decide how to move forward. This assess phase can be done for free, depending on the size of the engagement. It can be taken care of by AWS in terms of monetary expenditure, and we would be able to do it for you, probably for free, through AWS programs. So moving on in MAP, right? The Migration Acceleration Program. Not every application is made equal. So there are applications which can be moved as they are, others which we need to change them before moving them. So this is what the assess phase does. It defines the different workloads and how to move them. The how usually revolves around one of these 7 strategies. We call them the 7 R's. So you can either remove a workload if not required anymore. There will be instances of this. You can keep it on premise. You can move it as is to AWS. You can purchase something different from that, what you have now. You can move to AWS and improve on it. Or you can completely re-architect it, refactor it to make it cloud native and get the full value from it. So it's up to you, not up to you, up to the assess phase to decide how to move each workload, and each workload may be different. Whether to move it, how to move it, and whether to change things, increase value before moving or after moving to AWS. So with all that information and decisions taken in the assess phase, here we're showing that basically not everything is built the same, right? If I have 100 different workloads, some of them would be retired, some of them would be retained, etc. One best practice here is to use a different pattern for every workload, right? So not use a different pattern, but rather decide, keep your mind open to decide which ones of these to use per workload. And you can have different patterns, no problem at all. It's very normal to have different patterns. What's important is that modernization, then you focus it on what will give you business value. So if there is something like an internal system with minimal business value, you can move it to AWS, but maybe not modernize it. Another application which gives a lot of differentiating value, then modernize it to improve ability, agility, and reliability, cost savings, etc. So you can take different parts per workload, depending on the workload. So we spoke about the assess phase. Once you have a top-level directional business case, it's important to move to mobilize. Mobilize is all about going to the next step, start building the underlying architecture. And basically takes this format. So you create a detailed migration plan, you identify a POC, a proof of concept, you create a migration plan, and you create a landing zone, which is this best practice underlying infrastructure, which will take that workload and other future workloads. Designing the application to make sure it works on AWS and testing it, and then moving that application. Now, this would be wave one. So if you have 100 applications, you might move 5 of them. Doesn't mean it has to be one, but it could be one. Throughout all this, there is going to be different sprints where different things are done. So from security to operations to learning, certification of people who will be taking care of these in AWS. So all this leads to a first set of workloads, wave one, which is running best practice in AWS. Moving forward, then you are operating that wave one, but also you have learned a lot, applied that learning, maybe automated those migrations, and started moving wave 2, wave 3, etc. Always increasing the speed of migration, because you learn, you are more efficient, you move forward in faster ways. So this is literally seeing the whole picture here: assess, mobilize, migrate, and modernize. That's the methodology. A methodology which has been known to work very well, and it's what AWS wants us partners to do with our clients. Now, the program is not just the methodology, as we said, it's also a number of other things, a set of other enablers that ensure that the methodology works. First and foremost, you've got a bunch of tools. From AWS, so in the assess phase, you might use that migration evaluator, which we discussed. You might use the migration assessment. There are other tools as well, like the application discovery service, which goes much deeper into the applications themselves. Some of these tools might be used in different phases. So mobilize as well. Then there is things like creating that landing zone, that best practice underlying system. We can use a service like Control Tower to do that. Migration itself, there is Cloud Endure, which is a free service from AWS, allowing you to migrate servers without much downtime for free. Things like Data Sync, which allows you to move data to AWS. And ultimately then, operating and optimizing, modernizing on AWS, there is a bunch of tools there, which we can help you decide what to use. In totality, at the bottom, you've got a tracking system, what is called Migration Hub. This is a service which allows you to track the different servers and migrations being moved. And 56-bit, as well as other partners, can help you with this left to right, A to Z capabilities when moving to AWS. There are third-party tools as well, like Cloudemize and CloudChomp and AppDynamics, Dynatrace, New Relic. These are all hundreds, if not thousands, of other tools that you can find on the AWS marketplace that fit into this three-phase approach to migrations. Let's talk a bit about Cloud Endure. Cloud Endure was a company that was bought by AWS. Their product is now given for free by AWS for AWS customers. It allows you to very quickly and in a very flexible way migrate workloads as they are, what we call lift and shift. So if you have a server on premise, it takes a copy of that server, puts it on AWS, runs it there, and then shifts towards that new server. And this can be done for 1 server, for 10 servers, for 1,000 servers. It supports a wide range of operating systems and applications, databases as well. There are cutover windows that allow you to do changes in a non-disruptive manner. Everything encrypted, highly secure, for regulated environments as well. So the ability to move fast shows movement, shows progress, and then once you are on AWS, whether you used Cloud Endure or not, to move to AWS, then once you're there, you start modernizing, adding value to your system. So the Migration Acceleration Program has a methodology, has tooling from partners and AWS, and then there are the partners themselves. The partners, like 56-bit, they have experience on migrating to AWS. To be able to do that, they need at least an advanced level consultancy badge from AWS. These are validated badges, validated knowledge that aligns with best practices. 56-bit is an advanced partner. We are also well-architected partners, have a lot of knowledge when it comes to these migrations as well. We are experts in things, obviously AWS, but also Python, Terraform, Kubernetes, and a number of other technologies. Going forward, the program also includes professional services. Now, you can either choose to have professional services, meaning the operation on AWS, who takes care of the things on AWS. You can either self-manage it yourself using AWS tools like System Manager, Service Catalog. There are many, many tools, including third-party tools that you can use if you have the internal expertise. Of course, you can use a partner like 56-bit or other to do this, right? So we provide things like preventive maintenance and change requests, building infrastructure code, manual and automated checks, disaster recovery testing, support, 24/7 support with service level agreements. So we can help you manage your AWS infrastructure once moved to AWS. We can help you move and also operate it. So the program has this methodology with tooling that enables that methodology and partners and professional services that allow you to move and operate on AWS. But one thing which is always very important, irrelevant if you have a partner or not, is knowledge. And here is where AWS training comes in. AWS training is a world-class level of number of certifications that allow you to understand best practices of what to do on AWS. And there are different certifications. The most basic one is Cloud Practitioner, that's the entry level. But then you can go up to 3 other levels. So you've got associate level, like architecture or developer, right? If you're a developer, you would go for the developer associate. If you are more of an infrastructure person who is going to operate on AWS, you would do the SysOps administrator. Of course, you can become a professional, which is the highest level. You've got architects and DevOps engineers there. And then you can specialize in different areas as well, like data analysis, AI, data engineering, security, networking. So there is a little bit for everyone. Doesn't mean you have to have them all. It just means that whatever best direction to take, you can take it and should take it. And part of the mobilize phase is to create a plan, an upskilling plan for your workforce, to see where the gaps are, and then create a plan to get them up to speed on certain scenarios. It might not be AWS certifications, they might be project management certifications, Terraform, Kubernetes, maybe other technologies as well. There are also non-certifications, but they are courses, right? Courses which don't end up in certifications, like financial operations, for example, for your financial personnel. So those kind of FinOps are courses which don't have certifications attached to them, but there are lots and lots of them as well. So learning is an essential part, training is an essential part of this journey. Finally, AWS want to help us partners deliver migrations with customers, with our customers. And they do help. They put money where their mouth is, basically, through investments. In general, AWS can give up to 25% credits. So 25% of ARR. ARR is annual recurring revenue, meaning if you are going to spend $1 million per year, then you can get 25% of that, up to 25% of that back into you don't actually pay for it. You're using credits, right? You get credits. And if you're using things like Windows servers, or you're migrating databases from SQL Server to something more open source, for example, those all have even higher percentage credits. There is even financial incentives for partners from AWS to help you do the assess phase, right? That's why I told you that it might be even free, depending on size. So the assess phase could be done by a partner with investment from AWS. Amazon has committed to sustainability. They have committed in 2019 to the climate pledge, basically, which allows them to, or rather forces them to become net zero carbon efficient by 2040. There is a path, there is a plan to 100% renewable energy and have dedicated billions of dollars towards the fund itself. AWS has created infrastructure which is highly efficient That helps from a cost perspective. It also helps from a being green perspective, right? So lower carbon footprint as well as more energy efficient infrastructure. The program has important pieces as well, important elements to it when it comes to specialized workloads. So it's important that you don't just migrate. It's important that you migrate and modernize, or you modernize and then migrate after. The modernization is where the value really lies. So for example, if you have things on premise, you have high costs, but low value. As you move to AWS, your cost starts reducing if you right size your environment, if you use best practices. You might shift certain things to open source. You might start using managed services. Eventually, you might start using best practices like containers, DevOps, serverless. As you go to the right, your cost is going to reduce, your velocity and agility is going to increase. So that is the idea here. That's why we modernize, we change towards cloud native. And AWS helps you when it comes to these specialized workloads like databases, mainframes, Windows applications, SAP, VMware. All these are considered a bit specialized, and there are additional monetary incentives, credits that are given, as well as the ability to use AWS expertise when moving, technical guidance, training, special training, etc. So next steps in your migration journey is to do the assess phase. It's to identify a champion who will be an internal person that goes out and tries to understand what there is and ultimately decide whether to move or not. Maybe identify not just a single champion, but a group of champions from different areas. Schedule those important discovery phases, the technical phases, as well as the migration readiness assessment, which are important elements to know what you have, to ultimately decide of whether to move and how to move if yes. And then select a partner who can help get you funding to do this. So those are some next steps towards AWS migrations. Thank you, everyone. That's it from our end. I did leave some time, hopefully, let's see. Yes, 10 more minutes if you wish to ask any questions. Are there any questions? Please use the Q&A on the left-hand side of your screen. Was everything okay? May I have a thumbs up if all was good? All right, perfect. Any questions, please? Okay. It's very common not to get questions in these types of webinars. So I encourage you to reach out. That is my email address on screen. Feel free to reach out and I will help you accordingly should you have any questions from here on. Thank you so much and hope to see you on the next one. Goodbye.
The webinar has ended. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.